It was pretty tough times then. This was in the Depression. I got my first job at $1.25 a day. That job was a 10-hour-a-day job, and I was washing test tubes and slides in the county venereal disease laboratory. Since then, I have turned that into something to brag about, in that I am convinced that I am the only 12-year-old boy to be exposed to every sexually transmitted disease known to God and man, and no pleasure from it. So I just want to let you know that everybody has a dark side, and I've shared a couple of them with you. So let's get down to business. After World War I, the League of Nations passed a chemical weapons treaty. The U.S. did not sign that, and it was promptly ignored by the Japanese and the Italians. The Japanese used it in China, the Italians used it in Ethiopia. Chemical weapons were not used in World War II, as we all know, but there were massive stockpiles on both sides. And the U.S. was no doubt firmly documented that they intended to use massive amounts of chemical weapons on the invasion of Japan. So chemical weapons have been around, and in the period of time after World War II, many countries used chemical weapons. The best example were the Iraqis using it on the Iranians and on their own people. During the Cold War, it's estimated that 25 to 35 countries had stockpiles of chemical weapons. The USSR and our country had about 80% of all those weapons. At that point in time, probably there was somewhere between 180 and 200,000 tons of chemical weapons in the world. Now, for all of you that may not have translated that, when you look at a very small, tiny drop of one of the nerve agents is enough to kill you, imagine what 180,000 tons could do. By 1978, the UN had underway a chemical weapons treaty effort. And in fact, a number of countries had already started getting rid of their chemical weapons. But that left a lot to be desired because the Cold War was still pretty hot. You had Angola, you had Afghanistan, and you had the aftermath of Vietnam. It was just not a good time. In the U.S., things might have been slightly worse. Relations between government and the chemical industry, the kindest thing you could say was it was non-existent, but it was pretty damn bad. The courts were filled with lawsuits over the new environmental laws that they had passed. The government was suing industry was suing EPA, and the activists were suing everybody, and nobody was getting along. And if that wasn't enough, the armed forces were being treated like bastards at a family reunion by the administration. So you can step back and say, that is not a good time to get involved with a chemical weapons convention, because it would require close cooperation with the East and the West. It would require close cooperation between the armed forces and industry, and diplomats, and government and industry. And about the same time that that was going on, industry's ideas about chemical weapons was something like this: we don't make chemical weapons, we don't make intermediates, we don't want to make chemical weapons or intermediates, and furthermore, we'd like to get up in the morning and not even think about chemical weapons. Well, that was about the time that the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency approached the Chemical Industry Trade Association, CMA, and said they would like to have someone as a resource from industry to help them manage through a chemical weapons convention. And that was for both primary Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, but also for state and the Department of Defense. Now, to digress just a minute, the two primary weapons which I've just mentioned were the mustard gases and the nerve gases. The nerve gases, cholinesterase inhibitors, were virtually all phosphorus-based. Now, the nerve gases could be made using 1940 technology. Indeed, the Germans and the Allies had cholinesterase inhibitor chemical weapons in World War II, not used. The mustard gases could be made with 1915 technology, because that's when the first mustard gases were used. And these are still the major chemical weapons of today. With the diversity and the flexibility of the chemical industry on a worldwide basis, where they can switch from one product to another, where they can switch from one product line to another, where they can clean around and come up with a totally new product, any government can take over its industry, its chemical industry, and be in business to make chemical weapons. And this might be the most important statement I can make tonight for you to understand why I'm here. For valid, effective chemical weapons disarmament, the worldwide chemical industry not only has to come under the terms of the convention, it has to bring its knowledge to the convention preparation. And the three things, history, logic, and fact, demand that happen. The primary industry organization in the U.S. was Chemical Manufacturers Association. It accounted for 97% of all the chemicals made in the U.S. ACTA, the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, asked for someone that could work with them, and through a series of eliminations, I ended up being that person. My involvement extended to DOD, Department of Defense, state, other agencies. However, given the industry reluctance to even think about it, if I wanted to talk to anybody in the chemical industry about chemical weapons, other than the president of CMA, I kind of had to go look in the mirror. Nobody else wanted to talk with me about it. So I spent my time learning what was going on, what needed to be done, and in 1984, I formed a chemical weapons treaty committee for CMA, and there were 5 or 6 of us. I'd like to tick them off with the names because they're invaluable. Mike Wall was the trade association. Leo Zeftel was with DuPont. Don Claggett was with General Electric. Sean Ballou was with Stauffer, and Orrin Rutter and myself, we complemented one another. And we worked together for 16 years. And we all had our lives changed by what we'd gotten in. I might add that without exception, our bosses and their bosses' and so forth said, yeah, they can do it, but we don't give them any relief from their day job. So it did make for a rather full schedule most of the time. Now there's some fascinating stories. If we all had a beer and we had lots of time, I'd be happy to share with them, but there's some that are worth talking about. There was a German that we worked with, the ambassador, and he was the nephew of the German general that surrendered Paris in World War II. But the Frenchman was a nephew of the man who ran the Brittany French underground. But most of all, the one that was fascinating, there was a Yugoslav colonel, full colonel, and let me tell you, he looked like he could have stepped out of an Otto Preminger movie. He was kind of built like this at 6'4". He had the prerequisite saber scar across here and looked like he could bite nails in two. But also, He was a pathologist, a PhD pathologist. He was an MD. He was Tito's, then the dictator of Yugoslavia. He was Tito's personal physician, and if that wasn't enough, he was number 2 man in their secret police. And guess who the first person was I got into an argument with and lost? But we had a tough job on our hands. The chemical industry, as I said, didn't make chemical weapons, but today and then, the same intermediate that you and I use to make the ballpoint ink is a key ingredient for the making of mustard gas. Now that's not a very big volume item, you know, but nevertheless, it does make the point. At some point in time, by taking one step over or one step over this way, you can get into the business of making chemical weapons instead of useful products for industry. And so the world is full of compromises. Everything we do virtually is a compromise. When I would give talks before people like you, I would say, now, if you really want to, I can take the risk of chemical weapons down to 0. I don't mean any fraction of what I can take it to 0. All we have to do is to destroy every single chemical plant in the world, bar none. We'll level them, and there will not be a single person to die of chemical weapons. In fact, there won't even be anybody left to worry about them. Because most of the people will be dead and the rest of them will be living in caves. So that's one extreme. Now, if I could go out and create a chemical weapon that would not have any negative impact on industry, we could do that. But the evil people that would use chemical weapons would giggle all the way to their chemical weapons plant. So like everything else, you find a compromise. Now, the question is, and I want to get this right, how do you go about destroying all chemical weapon facilities and the weapons themselves? How do you make the risk and the penalties so tough on those that would violate that treaty and make chemical weapons that they'll decide on second thought, I don't want to make them? At the same time, how can you make the exposure, the cost, and the risk to law-abiding countries and companies within that framework? What sort of organization do you need to implement something like that? The chemical industry, as you might have gathered, is an extremely complex business. Size, technology, marketplace, storage, shipping, manufacturing, and ownership. The diplomats from all of the countries knew very little about chemistry and much less about the chemical industry. They had a potload of people that knew how to make chemical weapons, they knew how to use chemical weapons, they knew how to destroy chemical weapons, but nothing about the chemical industry. Now, by the same token, the chemical industry people that we had pulled together, the 6 of us, and the people that stood behind them, we didn't know about the world of diplomacy. We didn't know what their needs were. We didn't know the languages and so forth. I learned early on that I was extremely deficit in one thing. I was told that the definition of a diplomat is one that can tell you to go to hell so that you look forward to the trip. And I failed that many times in these negotiations. But nevertheless, when we recognized that both sides had to be taught, then things seemed a little bit more simple. And we spent 95% of our time teaching. We had to teach our people that the diplomats had valid concerns and valid needs, we had to teach the diplomats the same thing about us. We had valid concerns and valid needs. And we tried to get the 6 of us talking to as many different people in the industry and vice versa, so that we had a multiplicity of people talking to one another so that we came to understand each other.